Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about narratives. Our essential questions are: what is a narrative, and what are the elements of a narrative and how do they interact? By the time we're done taking our notes today, you should have some idea about how to answer those essential questions. What is a narrative? Narrative is the academic term that we use for the word story. So a narrative and a story, they're the same thing. And a narrative can be either fiction or nonfiction. We've read a couple examples of some fiction narratives with Eleven and the passage from Hatchet, and we read a nonfiction narrative example when we read the bit from Guts. The purpose of narratives is to entertain a reader by telling a story, but it's not just for entertainment. The author also wants you to think about some kind of bigger issue, something that's bigger than their story. And that issue is what we call the theme. Narratives are usually given in a sequential or chronological order structure, and that just means that the events are told to you as the reader in the order that they happened. So that word sequential, keep in mind the sequence of events. That's just another way of saying that the order that things happened in. Chronological means time order. Chrono means time and logical means like a record of it. So chronological is the record of the events as they happened in time. One thing to keep in mind about that sequential or chronological order is sometimes that it gets interrupted with flashbacks. And flashbacks are just where the author gives you a little peek back at something that occurred before the story started, or it might be a reminder to something that happened earlier in the text. If you have a flashback, you should stop and think about what the order of events in the story actually is, so that you understand which event triggered the next one. That will help boost your comprehension of the story. So now that we know what a narrative is and we know what they usually look like, let's start analyzing the different pieces or elements that help to make a strong and interesting narrative. One thing for you to remember is that all of the different elements that we're going to talk about today, they all work together, they interact with each other, and they can affect each other as well. And you'll see questions about how the different elements interact or affect each other on your tests and stuff. So it's good to understand these notes so that you are aware of the different ways that these elements can interact, and you can use that information to help boost your comprehension of the stories you read, and also to help you be a better writer. If you understand how to use these pieces, how they're supposed to work together, that will help you make a better crafted and more interesting story. The first element of a narrative that we're going to talk about is point of view, also known as POV. And that's just the type of narration that we're going to get in the story. We've talked about this already, we've taken notes on it, so I'm not going to go terribly in depth with it here, but just a reminder that there are 5 main types of narrative point of view. There's first person point of view, where the narrator is the main character in the story, or usually the main character in the story, and they use words like I, me, mine, etc. to explain what they're doing as the story progresses. Then there's second person point of view, where the narrator makes you, the reader, a character in the story. The narrator uses words like you and your, telling you, the reader, what you're doing and what you're thinking as the story progresses. And then there are 3 types of third person narration that all use the he, she, it, they, them third person pronouns to tell the story. Third person objective is where the narrator can see the events that are happening in the story and describe all of them. Third person omniscient means that that narrator sees everything, but they also know everything that the characters, all the characters, are thinking and feeling. And finally, the last type is third person limited omniscient, where the narrator knows everything that's going on, but they only know the thoughts and feelings of one or two characters. So point of view affects how much information we have about the plot events in the story and what characters are thinking and feeling. Depending on the point of view, we either have more information or less information. If I have a third person omniscient narrator, then I know everything, and I might see the same event told from different perspectives to get a fuller picture. If I'm getting a first person narrator, I might feel like I am understanding things from that character's point of view really well, but I have to keep in mind that I'm only hearing one side of the story. And I'm not seeing everything. And I also have to keep in mind that that first person narrator could be not very trustworthy. So point of view can affect the events in the story, or what we know about the events and what we know about the characters. The second element we're going to talk about is the setting. You guys have probably talked about setting since at least kindergarten. But something to keep in mind about setting is that it's not just the where of a story, it's also the when. The when could be just as important or even more important than the where. So keep in mind that it's both of those things. So setting can affect or interact with the other elements in a couple main ways. The first way that it affects our story is that it can influence what's possible, what kind of events could actually happen. So if I had a story set in space in the future, then having people travel by rockets is possible, right? Whereas if the story is set in the Wild West in the past, I'm probably not going to have any rocket travel, right? And the other way that it could affect the story is what kind of characters I get, or what the characters are like. So going back to that space example, there's a strong possibility that I'm going to have astronauts, right? Or some kind of scientist character. Whereas in a story set in the Wild West in the past, I'm probably going to have cowboys and Native Americans and, those kinds of battles and stuff going on. So setting can affect what is possible in the story and what the characters are like. The third narrative element that we're going to consider is mood. Mood basically is what it sounds like. It's how the story feels. And just like you have your different moods and stuff based on the things that have happened to you, the things that happen in the story help influence how the story feels. So if you're reading a horror book, the mood of the story is probably going to be scary and tense, right? If you're reading something like Diary of a Wimpy Kid, the mood of the story is probably going to be funny or silly, right? And you don't have to just use one word to describe a mood. You're definitely not limited to the words that I've gotten here. Just like there are different ways to describe your moods, there are hundreds of ways to describe the moods of a story. And the mood of a story can change, just like the setting of a story can change. As events become more exciting, etc., the story might get more tense than it originally was. So mood can change throughout a story, just like setting does. So, mood can affect pretty much every other element in the story. For example, the type of narration we have can affect the mood of the story. If we are listening to a first-person narrator, how they're feeling about events in the story is going to affect the overall mood of the story. The setting of the story can cause the mood to feel a certain way. So for example, if I have chosen to set my story in a haunted house, the mood is probably going to be more scary and tense. And vice versa, if the author has decided that they want their story to feel a certain way, they're probably going to choose a particular setting to help develop that mood. The way that characters react to events in the story can also affect the mood of it, and the mood can affect how the characters react to events. So, for example, if we're reading the story and we can feel that the characters are tense or they're confused or unsure of something, that's going to help set that kind of mood. Or if the mood of the story has already been set by the setting of like a haunted house or something, we would expect the characters to be reacting to that spooky setting and that spooky mood and feel a little spooked themselves. The fourth element of a story would be the characters or the actors of the story. And in a fiction piece, we call them characters. In nonfiction, we call them actors. And basically, it's just the people or animals that are doing the actions in the story. All right, so we've already talked about how the elements that we talked about previously can affect the characters and how characters can affect those. One more thing for you guys to keep in mind about how characters interact with other elements is that the characters are the ones that are making the things happen in the story. So they are the ones who are making the plot events happen. And they do that either by causing the events or by reacting to them. And interactions between characters can lead to these plot events. So I've talked about plot a couple times already in the notes, and you might not be 100% sure of what plot is, but plot is just the term that we use to describe all of the events that happen in a story. So a plot can actually be broken up and analyzed into 6 pieces using what you guys might have learned as the elements of a plot when you were in elementary school. Or you can hear it called the storytelling arc. I prefer to call it the storytelling arc, but either term is accurate. They're synonyms for each other. So in the storytelling arc, we have 6 ways to further divide the plot to understand what kind of action we should be expecting. At the beginning of the story, you can see that we've got this bit called the exposition or the introduction. They mean the same thing. So in the exposition/introduction, you're being introduced to the protagonist of the story, and we usually get a little peek into their everyday life. We also are introduced to that initial setting. I say initial because remember, the setting of the story can change as the story progresses. As part of the exposition, you can see this little circle here at the end of it. That's when the conflict is introduced. And once the conflict is introduced, that's when we really have a story. If we don't have a conflict, we just end up with a list of events that happen to somebody, and that's not the most interesting thing to read. So every good narrative has a conflict, and conflict is just another word for problem. So the conflict is introduced, and that's when we as readers get to see what the main problem of the story is. Everything from here on out in the story revolves around this conflict. The events that happen afterwards are events where the problem is increasing in some way and the protagonist is trying to do something about it. So after the conflict has been introduced, then we have this uphill slope here where we have what we call rising action. Rising action is just all of the events that occur after the conflict has been introduced, but before the problem starts to get solved. And you can see that it's on this like uphill slope. That's showing us that the problem is becoming more intense in some way. So the action is building up. And then once the action has built all the way to a tipping point, we reach the climax. The climax is the most exciting part of the story. It's the part that everything else in the story has been building up to. Here is the trick to it. The climax is when the conflict is about to be solved. It's not actually when the problem is solved. It's when we're not sure whether the problem will be solved or not. So if you think about it, if we're thinking about like Harry Potter again, when Harry Potter is fighting Voldemort at the end of a story, that's what everything has been building up to. It's the most exciting part, and it's exciting because we aren't 100% sure which way the conflict will be solved. Will Voldemort win or will Harry win? When it can go either way like that, that's when you're at the climax. After the climax, we have this downhill slope, and that is called the falling action. The falling action is basically just the events that take place between the climax and the end of the story. It's basically we're seeing the process of all of the loose ends being tied up. And then finally, all of that falling action leads to the resolution. And resolution is just a fancy way of saying the end. Resolution comes from the word resolve, and when you resolve something, you have solved it or you fixed it. So that means our resolution is when everything has been fixed in the story and it's come to a satisfying end. So one thing I really need you guys to remember about plot is that without a conflict as part of the plot, there isn't a story. We have to have a conflict that the story can revolve around. We have to have a conflict for the rising actions to happen. We have to have a conflict for the climax to happen. We have to have a conflict for resolution. So everything revolves around the conflict. So I've already talked a lot about how the other elements impact plot, but I want you guys to keep in mind that plot affects all of those things as well. The plot helps the characters grow and develop. The plot moves us to different places in a setting, etc. And the other thing that I need you guys to know is that how the characters react to and solve the plot events helps reveal and helps develop the story's theme. And remember that theme is that underlying message, that life lesson that the author wants us to have thought about while we've read their story. So the final narrative element that we're going to be talking about is theme. And we've taken notes on theme already. Remember, theme is that life lesson that you're supposed to think about or learn from the text. And it could be about anything. It could be about our relationships with other people. It could be about society in general. It could be about how we're supposed to move through the world. Here are some examples of some themes that crop up again and again in a lot of literature. Look before you leap, which basically means think about what you do before you do it, right? Be careful what you wish for. Sometimes the thing you thought you want isn't always really what you truly need, right? And the last one, love conquers all. That one shows up all over the place, right? As long as we love each other, things will end up okay. But these are all life lessons, things that we're supposed to think about or to have had some kind of thought about while we were reading. Theme is incredibly important in the story. Once the author has thought through a little bit what their characters are like and that kind of stuff, they might settle on what they want a theme in their story to be. And based on that theme, they use it to help develop even further what the characters are like. What kind of plot events will help the characters learn that theme? Which kind of setting is going to best help promote that theme as well? And so all of the other narrative elements work together to develop the theme of the story. Or think of all the other elements as like pieces in a puzzle. And when we have them all snapped together right, we can see the theme. And as I said, the theme is in part what's shaping everything else in the story. So the theme helps to shape everything else, and when everything else is put together into one piece, the puzzle is solved, then we can see the theme. And the theme, one thing to watch out for to help you determine theme is how the characters are changing and growing and what they're learning from solving the conflict. By looking at those things, you'll usually end up with a good idea of what the theme of the story is. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information. To help that information to all come together in your head, I want you to go back and take the time to write a thoughtful summary that answers our essential questions. The essential questions were, what is a narrative? And what are the elements of a narrative, and how do they interact? Make sure you also have questions in your questions column that you think that I might ask you on a test or a quiz, so that you can use these notes as a study tool as well. All right, guys, have a great day.